Inflation does not make everyone poorer. It makes some people poorer and some people richer. Who it does what to is determined entirely by what you own. This is why fighting inflation is never just economics. It is always politics dressed as arithmetic, that reframing changes everything. Because the public conversation about inflation, the headlines, the central bank press conferences, the political speeches, treats it as a universal affliction. A rising tide of prices that lifts the cost of everything equally for everyone. An impersonal force of economic nature that governments and central banks must heroically battle for the common good. That framing is not accidental. It serves specific interests. And seeing whose interests it serves requires seeing what inflation actually is before accepting what we are told it is. Start with the definition. Inflation is a general rise in the price level across an economy over time. When inflation is present, a given amount of money buys less than it did before. The purchasing power of the currency declines. So far, this sounds like a story about money becoming less valuable, and it is that. But it is also, simultaneously, a story about real things becoming more valuable relative to money. And the person who holds real things, property, commodities, equity in productive businesses, assets whose prices rise with or ahead of inflation, is not losing purchasing power. They are gaining it, relative to the person who holds only money. This is the distributional truth that almost never leads the inflation conversation. The person whose wealth is primarily in cash or in wages denominated in cash loses when inflation rises. The person whose wealth is primarily in assets whose nominal price rises with inflation is protected, and in many cases benefits. Inflation is not a tax on everyone equally. It is a tax on holding money, and the people who hold the most money relative to assets are the people with the least. Now go to where inflation actually comes from. Because the explanation most widely deployed, too much money chasing too few goods, is correct as far as it goes, and deeply misleading in how it is used. Too much money chasing too few goods can produce inflation. When the supply of money expands faster than the supply of real goods and services, prices rise. This is the quantity theory of money, and it captures something real about the mechanism of inflation. But it does not tell you why the money supply expanded, or why the supply of goods contracted, or who made the decisions that produced those conditions, or whose interests those decisions served. It describes the mechanism without touching the politics inside the mechanism. Inflation in 2021 and 2022 in the United States was attributed primarily to pandemic-related supply chain disruptions and to the expansion of the money supply through emergency fiscal and monetary policy during COVID. Both factors were real, but something else was happening simultaneously that received almost no attention in the mainstream account. Corporate profit margins expanded dramatically during the inflationary period. Companies passed on cost increases to consumers and then some. In sector after sector, food, energy, shipping, housing, prices rose faster than input costs, and the difference was captured as profit. The economist Isabella Weber documented this through detailed industry analysis and called it seller's inflation. The concentration of corporate power in many sectors, the oligopolies we examined when we looked at markets, meant that firms faced with rising costs did not simply pass them on. They used the inflationary moment, in which rising prices were universally expected and therefore universally accepted as cover for margin expansion. Consumers expecting prices to rise did not resist. The expectation of inflation became the permission for inflation beyond what costs alone would have produced. This is a story about corporate power, using inflation as a mechanism of wealth transfer. It received far less attention than the story about government spending and money creation, because the story about government spending and money creation supports a particular conclusion: reduce government spending, raise interest rates, restore fiscal discipline, while the story about corporate pricing power supports a different conclusion: regulate concentration, control prices in critical sectors, and the second conclusion is far less palatable to those who shape the terms of the public debate. Now go to the response. Because how societies choose to fight inflation is as revealing as what causes it. The standard tool is the one we examined when we looked at interest rates. The central bank raises rates, borrowing becomes more expensive, spending slows, demand falls, prices stabilize. The medicine works in the sense that it does reduce inflation. But look at who drinks it. Higher interest rates hit borrowers. The person with a variable rate mortgage feels it in their monthly payment. The small business that needs a credit line to make payroll feels it in their cost of operation. The developing country whose government debt is denominated in dollars feels it in the cost of servicing that debt. The worker in the sectors most sensitive to interest rate increases, construction, manufacturing, consumer durables, feels it in their job security as those sectors slow. Higher interest rates do not directly constrain the corporation with a strong balance sheet and access to bond markets at favorable terms. They do not constrain the wealthy household with minimal debt and a portfolio of assets appreciating ahead of inflation. They do not constrain the financial institutions whose business model involves earning the spread between the rates they charge and the rates they pay, a spread that typically widens when rates rise. The interest rate instrument inflation by reducing the spending capacity of those who borrow, who are disproportionately those with less. It protects the purchasing power of savings which are disproportionately held by those with more. It is a redistribution mechanism as a stabilization tool. The disguise is so effective that even most of the people harmed by it accept the necessity of the medicine, without examining whose definition of necessity is being applied. Now go to the extremes. Because the extremes reveal the true nature of the thing in ways the moderate cases conceal. Hyperinflation, inflation so severe that prices double in months or even days, is one of the most economically and socially destructive phenomena a society can experience. The Weimar Republic in 1923 is the canonical example. Prices rose so fast that workers were paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before they lost value. People carried money in wheelbarrows, not because they were rich, but because the denomination of individual bills had become worthless. The savings of the middle class, people who had worked for decades, accumulated modest wealth in bank accounts and bonds, practiced exactly the financial virtue that is always urged on them, were wiped out entirely. The hyperinflation transferred real purchasing power from those whose wealth was in money to those whose wealth was in real things, in foreign currency, in gold, in productive assets. The political consequences of that transfer were catastrophic. The destruction of the middle-class savings base was one of the conditions that made the rise of fascism in Germany possible. Not the only condition, but a significant one. When the economic framework within which ordinary people had organized their lives and built their futures collapses, the political conclusions they draw are not always the ones that serve them or anyone else. This is why the trauma of Weimar is so deeply embedded in German economic culture, and why the Bundesbank and then the European Central Bank were structured around an almost theological commitment to price stability. The institutional memory of hyperinflation produces a policy orthodoxy that prioritizes fighting inflation above almost all other considerations. That orthodoxy has costs, in growth foregone, in unemployment sustained longer than necessary, in the austerity imposed on southern European countries during the debt crisis of the 2010s. But the costs are accepted because the alternative, in the institutional memory, is not merely economic discomfort, but civilizational collapse. Historical trauma shapes economic policy in ways that are rarely acknowledged explicitly and are not always appropriate to the present circumstances. Germany's hyperinflation of 1923 was produced by a specific combination of war reparations, political dysfunction, and deliberate money printing that is not present in every inflationary episode. But the institutional response it generated applies regardless. Now go to something almost no one discusses. The inflation that is acceptable and the inflation that is not acceptable tells you whose interests monetary policy actually serves. Asset price inflation, the rising prices of stocks, property, financial instruments, is not counted in the standard measures of consumer price inflation. When house prices double in a decade, the official inflation figures do not capture this as inflation. The person who owns a house experiences it as wealth creation. The person who does not own a house experiences it as the cost of shelter rising beyond reach. The first person is not counted as experiencing inflation. The second person is not counted at all. This asymmetry is structural. The consumer price index measures the cost of a basket of goods and services consumed by typical households. It does not measure the rising cost of acquiring assets. When central banks target 2% consumer price inflation, while allowing asset prices to run unconstrained, they are making a choice about which kind of price increase matters and which kind does not. The choice consistently benefits those who already own assets at the expense of those trying to acquire them. The asset price inflation of the decade following 2008, produced by near-zero interest rates and quantitative easing, was the policy response to the financial crisis we examined in the last video. It stabilized the financial system. It also produced the largest expansion of wealth inequality in the post-war period, as the value of financial assets held primarily by the wealthy grew dramatically, while wage income for most workers remained stagnant. The medicine for the crisis was a larger dose of the condition that made the crisis inevitable. Now bring this into the texture of your actual day, into the price of the food you bought this week, the rent that arrived this month, the savings sitting in an account earning less than the rate at which their purchasing power is declining. Inflation is not happening to the economy as an abstract entity. It is happening to specific people in specific ways that are determined by the specific assets and liabilities that make up their specific financial position. And that position was not randomly assigned. It was produced by the same structures of ownership and debt and inheritance and access that we have been examining throughout this entire series. The person who feels inflation most is the person with the least cushion, who has no assets appreciating ahead of it, who holds money they earned and watches it buy less, who cannot raise their prices the way a corporation can, because their price is their wage and wages rise last and least in inflationary periods, who cannot escape into assets, because assets require capital they do not have. The person who feels inflation least is the person whose position is already defined by ownership, who holds real things, who can raise prices, whose debt, fixed in nominal terms, becomes cheaper in real terms as prices rise around it. The question that stays open after all of this is not about monetary policy or interest rates, or what the central bank should do next. It is more immediate, more personal. The money you are holding right now, sitting in your account, earned by your time, saved by your discipline, is losing value while you read this. Slowly, continuously, by design, because a small amount of inflation is the explicit goal of every major central bank in the world. And the question is not what to do about that. The question is whether you knew it, whether anyone told you that the money you were taught to save is, by the architecture of the system, always in the process of becoming worth less than it was. And if they did not tell you that, why not? And who benefits from you not knowing?